November 3rd, 2023, 11:47 p.m., Boston, Massachusetts. Emergency sirens cut through the cold autumn night as patrol cars raced toward St. Augustine's Rectory in the historic North End. Officers pushed through the heavy oak doors, their boots echoing against marble floors, still wet from evening rain. Inside the priest's private quarters, they found Detective Michael Hayes kneeling beside a body. His hands covered in blood, his department-issued shirt soaked through. Father Thomas Hayes lay motionless on the Persian rug, his white collar stained crimson. 58 stab wounds, the medical examiner would later count. 58 moments of rage that transformed a decorated detective into a killer. When officers asked what happened, Michael looked up with hollow eyes and whispered, "He destroyed everything, everything we believed in." Within hours, the story would dominate every news channel from Portland to Miami. A respected detective murders his own brother, a beloved priest, in an apparent crime of passion. But the truth, the real truth, lay buried in a secret investigators would take weeks to uncover, hidden in the shadows of a family that valued reputation above honesty. Portland, Oregon, early 1990s. The Hayes household sat in a tree-lined neighborhood where American flags hung from porches and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through open windows each morning. 2 brothers lived there, whose futures seemed predetermined from birth. Thomas, the eldest, carried himself with the seriousness of someone twice his age. Even at 12, he spoke in measured phrases and kept his school uniform pressed without being told. His younger brother, Michael, was everything Thomas wasn't: loud, impulsive, always moving, filling rooms with equal parts laughter and chaos. Their father, a decorated police captain, ran the household with military precision. Discipline was non-negotiable. Respect was earned through obedience. Their mother, a devout Catholic who attended Mass 3 times weekly, believed family honor was sacred, and any crack in their public image was a sin against God and legacy. At dinner, conversation always centered on Thomas's achievements. First place in the debate tournament again, their father would announce, chest swelling with pride. Then, turning to Michael with a frown, he'd add, "Maybe you should learn from your brother's example." Those words, meant as guidance, fell like stones on Michael's chest. Report cards came back with average grades and comments about his lack of focus. His attempts at humor were corrected. Even when he scored the winning goal in a neighborhood soccer match, his father merely reminded him that sports wouldn't pay for college. Nobody noticed how Michael's smile faded a little more each time Thomas was praised. Nobody saw how comparison became the language of their home. Thomas's world revolved around structure and control. He loved rules, precision, and the satisfaction of being recognized as exceptional. Michael craved attention, not from vanity, but because he rarely received it unless he misbehaved. When their father disciplined him, Thomas was often held up as the model. He took it seriously, not realizing his perfection deepened the distance between them with each passing year. What began as sibling rivalry became something darker. By the mid-90s, the brothers had become 2 different versions of the same strict upbringing. Thomas wore responsibility like armor. Michael wore rebellion like a badge, hoping someone would finally notice him for who he was, rather than what he'd failed to become. Teachers said Thomas was exceptional. They said Michael was distracted, though the tone carried disappointment. When Thomas won a national essay competition in 1996, their mother framed the newspaper clipping and hung it in the living room, where every visitor could see it. Michael's name appeared nowhere on those walls. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" became the family refrain, repeated so often it lost its sting and simply became fact. When Thomas graduated with honors from Boston College, their father stood in his formal uniform, radiating pride in every gesture. Michael clapped from the audience with clenched jaw and tears in his eyes, not from joy, but from the crushing realization that no matter what he did, he'd always exist in someone else's shadow. Years later, mutual friends would remember Michael's silence that day. One recalled, "You could tell he loved Thomas, but it was the kind of love that hurt to carry." The weight of constant comparison became the foundation of a resentment neither brother fully acknowledged. Through their 20s, Thomas followed an impeccable path: seminary, ordination, rapid ascension within the Archdiocese of Boston. His discipline never wavered. But Michael bounced from one ambition to another, first criminal justice, then private security, then a brief attempt at opening a sports bar in South Boston. None lasted. His friends remembered him as a charming guy, but without fixed direction. Bills piled up. Phone calls to his brother shifted from casual conversations to requests for loans. Thomas always helped, but his tone made it feel like charity. "You need to get serious, Michael," he'd say with the authority of an older brother who'd already given up hearing new excuses. Michael's responses were dry. "Not everyone gets it right the first time, Thomas." Behind those words hid a bitterness he could never fully admit. The years between them grew longer. Thomas became proof that discipline worked. Michael became the reminder that not everyone could meet those standards. Their father's death in 2009 brought them under the same roof for a week, long enough for old tensions to resurface. During the wake, their mother took both sons' hands and said, "Promise me you'll take care of each other." Thomas promised immediately. Michael didn't respond. In 2012, their mother's health began to decline. Hospital visits filled with polite conversations between brothers who no longer knew what to say beyond surface courtesies. Michael stayed overnight when Thomas couldn't. He helped with medications, read prayer books, and for the first time in years, felt useful. Nurses said he was kind and patient. Thomas only saw disorganization. Pills poorly sorted, appointments sometimes missed. One night he gently scolded Michael for forgetting to refill a prescription. "Mum depends on precision," he said. Michael's response was quiet but sharp. Not everything can be fixed with a checklist. Their mother passed 2 months later. At the funeral they stood side by side in matching dark suits, united in grief but separated by miles in their hearts. Afterward, Thomas returned to his promising position at St. Augustine's in Boston, carrying the Hayes legacy with him. Michael stayed in Portland, working part-time jobs that barely covered rent. Neighbors saw him walking alone through Laurelhurst Park at dusk, headphones in, gaze distant. He used to be so full of life, one recalled later, but after his mother died, it was like something inside him went dark. When bills fell behind, Thomas intervened again, sending money, paying several months' rent, never asking how things had gotten so bad. But each transfer came with tacit judgment. Michael felt it in every brief message. "Take care of yourself." It sounded less like concern and more like disappointment wrapped in courtesy. Family was everything to the Hayes family, but only when it looked respectable from the outside. Reputation was their religion. Being honorable mattered more than being honest. For Thomas, maintaining that image was a matter of survival, the only way he knew to make sense of a world where weakness had consequences. For Michael, it became a curse. He learned early that to be seen, he'd have to break the image his family had worked so hard to create. When Thomas was appointed pastor of St. Augustine's in 2016, the Boston Globe ran glowing profiles. They called him the future of American Catholicism. That same week, Michael's electricity was shut off for non-payment. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Friends say Michael sent a congratulatory text, brief, formal, unanswered. He didn't attend the celebration dinner. It was his moment, Michael told a friend later. "I didn't want to be the reminder of everything he'd worked so hard not to become." Over the following years, contact dwindled to birthdays and Christmas. When they spoke, conversations filled with politeness and uncomfortable pauses. Yet beneath each word, resentment simmered. Thomas felt proud of what he'd built. Michael felt pain over what he'd lost, attention, affection, and the belief that he mattered equally. In 2019, when Michael finally moved to Boston, Thomas offered to help him settle in. He bought groceries, gave him spare furniture, introduced him to professional contacts in the city. To everyone else it looked like generosity, but to Michael it was pity wrapped in obligation. "I'm not a charity case," he said one night when Thomas tried offering rent money. Thomas didn't argue, just sighed and said, "You need stability, Michael. You can't keep running from it." That phrase would echo for years, because soon it wouldn't be Michael who was running. Their story began like so many others, two brothers raised under pressure, one brilliant, one struggling. But beneath their shared past hid a fracture nobody could see, a toxic mixture of envy, duty, and silence that would one day become catastrophic. Boston, Massachusetts, spring 2014. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza hummed with quiet ambition. Priests, theologians, and community leaders gathered for the annual Archdiocesan Conference, a night where professional courtesy disguised political maneuvering and first impressions could mark an entire career. Among the elegantly dressed crowd, Father Thomas Hayes stood out not because he sought attention, but because he commanded it naturally. His reputation preceded him, confident, eloquent, every gesture controlled. He was known for his sharp theological reasoning and ability to silence a room without raising his voice. That night, his conversation was interrupted by a woman he'd only seen in passing before. Sister Catherine Morrison, a rising administrator from Catholic Charities with a commanding presence that matched his own. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. "Father Hayes, I've been eager to meet the man who inspires half the seminarians in this city," she said with a tone both professional and warm. Thomas's expression softened slightly, the closest thing to amusement he allowed in public. "And you must be the sister who convinced the Archdiocese that community outreach deserves equal funding as building renovations," he responded. Both smiled. A rare human moment in a room full of rehearsed charm. It wasn't flirtation, it was recognition, the kind that emerges between two people who see, reflected in each other, discipline and dedication. That first conversation lasted nearly 90 minutes. They discussed theological theories, shared frustration over bureaucratic inefficiency, and mutual belief that faith meant serving society, not just preserving tradition. Later, Thomas told a colleague, "She's formidable. You can tell every word she says, she means it." Catherine, for her part, told a friend, "He speaks like someone who still believes the church can change lives, not just judge them." That was the beginning of something neither had planned. Over the following months they crossed paths, often at conferences, parish events, and charity functions. What began as professional respect became quiet admiration. Thomas admired Catherine's unwavering moral compass. She admired his intellectual precision and calm authority. Their partnership became the talk of the Archdiocese. Two dedicated servants working tirelessly on community programs, homeless outreach, and youth education initiatives. By early 2015, they were inseparable in their ministry. The Catholic community of Boston watched them with approval. Colleagues admired how well they seemed to fit together, intellect joined with conviction, discipline with compassion. At a fundraising gala held at a restored church in Cambridge, cameras flashed as they worked the room together. Catherine looked elegant and purposeful. Thomas couldn't hide his respect for her, but among the crowd of smiling faces, one pair of eyes watched differently. Michael Hayes stood near the bar in a suit that fit slightly wrong, his glass refilled more often than appropriate. He hadn't had a close relationship with his brother for years, but family obligations demanded attendance. As music played, he watched the woman his brother worked alongside. The confidence in her posture, the warmth in her voice when she greeted guests, the way she treated Thomas with genuine respect and admiration. Later, a friend remembered Michael whispering almost to himself, "She treats him like he's something precious." When asked about his first impression of Sister Catherine, Michael wrote later in a private journal entry dated May 18th, 2016, "She spoke to me like I existed, like my presence mattered." Nobody had done that in years. The words were simple, but carried enormous weight. Admiration mixed with longing, though he didn't fully understand it yet. In photographs from that night, Michael appears at the edges of group photos, smiling faintly with distant gaze. By early 2023, Father Thomas Hayes had become one of the most recognizable figures in Boston's Catholic community. His parish operated with mechanical efficiency. He was sharp, precise, and unwavering in matters of doctrine and pastoral care. He presided over cases involving marriage counseling, addiction recovery programs, and youth outreach initiatives. His sermons often made the Archdiocese newsletter. Some called him fair, others called him cold. The Boston Catholic Voice once described him as the unyielding face of modern priesthood. Social media comments multiplied after a televised debate on church reform. "Heartless priest cares more about rules than people," one headline read. The intent was to hurt, and it succeeded. But Thomas never admitted it publicly. Every decision was backed by canon law. Every choice, he told himself, was about faith, not feelings. Still, when he returned to the rectory at night, the silence after those controversies began to sound louder than any applause. The weight of the collar grew heavier with each passing month. Each pastoral decision created new critics. Families who disagreed with his counseling approach, parishioners who wanted a warmer, more lenient shepherd. Anonymous threats slipped through parish security, late-night calls from blocked numbers. His staff filtered most messages before they reached him, but some got through anyway. "You don't deserve to judge anyone," one voicemail said. "You're destroying faith because you can." He deleted it immediately, but the voice stayed with him for days. The respect that once made him feel purposeful now felt suffocating. How could someone who'd built his entire identity around serving God begin to doubt if he still believed in his calling? At the rectory, Sister Catherine was first to notice the changes. He arrived late, left his breviary by the door, and headed straight to his office without a word. The warmth that once filled the parish faded, giving way to polite coexistence. Dinners became silent events. 2 plates, minimal eye contact, conversations about ministry that never touched anything real. When she finally confronted him one evening, her voice was gentle but firm. "Thomas, you're not yourself. You haven't been for months." He responded without looking up from his papers. "I'm fine, just exhausted." But he wasn't fine. He was isolating the way people do when the world demands more than they have left to give. Catherine suggested he speak with someone, perhaps the Archdiocese counselor specializing in clergy burnout. "You're carrying too much alone," she said quietly. He turned to her with tired but resolute expression. "I solve problems, Catherine. I don't have them." That phrase became his shield and his unraveling. The emotional distance between him and everyone around him grew silently, the kind you don't notice until the gap becomes too wide to cross. Thomas tried small gestures, left notes on Catherine's desk, prepared coffee for early morning staff meetings, suggested a weekend retreat in the Berkshires. But she barely noticed. Her workload had become overwhelming, and her own calling had become an escape from emotional connection that required energy she no longer had. In early spring 2023, tension at St. Augustine's had settled like dust over everything. Even small disagreements sounded sharper than they should. Thomas wanted to organize a parish renewal program. Catherine said no, explaining she had to coordinate volunteer schedules. When he gently insisted, she snapped. "This isn't about you, Thomas. Some of us have responsibilities we can't postpone." Then came silence, the kind that feels colder than anger. That summer, something disrupted their fragile routine. Michael, who'd moved out nearly 2 years earlier after finding sporadic security work, returned. The message he sent was brief and deliberately vague. "Need to start over. Can I stay for a while?" Thomas hesitated, remembering the strain from last time, but Catherine agreed almost immediately. "Family takes care of each other," she said, a statement that sounded noble but came from guilt. Deep down, she knew she'd been emotionally distant during his previous stay, too consumed by work to offer real support. When Michael arrived, he seemed different, thinner, quieter, but with a familiar charm that made people lower their guard. He said his last job had ended badly, and he needed time to sort things out. Catherine offered him the rectory guest room without hesitation. Thomas helped carry boxes, unaware that decision would mark the beginning of everything unraveling. At first, things seemed calm. Michael made himself useful around the rectory, prepared meals, kept common areas organized, tried not to be a burden. To anyone watching, he seemed like a grateful man given a second chance. But what began as temporary soon stretched indefinitely. Thomas's demanding pastoral schedule kept him away from dawn until late evening. Catherine worked long hours coordinating parish programs and often brought files home. It was in those quiet moments, between the clatter of dishes and the hum of the coffee maker, that Michael began settling into a rhythm that wasn't his to claim. Catherine noticed his efforts and thanked him often. "You didn't have to clean the entire kitchen, Michael," she said one morning after finding everything organized. He smiled gently and responded, "You both work too hard. Someone has to keep this place from falling apart." She laughed lightly, unaware that each kind word fed something inside him he didn't know how to control. Thomas treated him with distant courtesy, always maintaining the invisible line separating family obligation from genuine connection. Catherine, however, spoke to Michael like he was a person, not a problem. She asked about his day, listened when he talked about past struggles, never made him feel like a failure. For a man who'd spent his entire life being compared unfavorably to his brother, that basic human decency was like sunlight after years in shadow. The rectory operated with precision: breakfast at 6:30, morning prayers at 7, parish duties until evening. Michael admired that discipline at first, even tried to mirror it, but he also saw how rigid it became. During a staff dinner, Thomas corrected Catherine mid-sentence about a procedural detail she'd mentioned regarding a community program. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was definitive, leaving no room for discussion. The table went silent for several seconds before she simply nodded and changed subjects. Michael caught the slight tension in her expression, and something shifted inside him. Later, when they cleared the table together, he said quietly, "You don't have to let him correct you all the time." Catherine smiled politely, but looked uncomfortable. "Thomas doesn't mean anything by it. It's just how he processes things." Michael didn't respond, but in that silence something was already taking shape. Over the following weeks, he began noticing every small detail of their interaction. The dry tone Thomas used when Catherine forgot something minor, the goodnight that was polite but emotionless, how their conversations often became subtle corrections disguised as guidance. What others would consider a typical dynamic between two overworked clergy members, Michael saw as proof Catherine wasn't appreciated. She was taken for granted, emotionally neglected. In his mind, he began constructing a different narrative, one where he was the person who truly understood her. "She deserves someone who listens," he whispered to himself one night while folding laundry in the guest room. At first, it was harmless thinking. Catherine's nature didn't help. She was kind to everyone, especially those who seemed to need support. When Michael received a rejection email for a security position he'd hoped to get, Thomas barely looked up from his theological texts. But Catherine brought him coffee and said gently, "You'll find your place, Michael. You're more capable than you think." The moment was brief, but it stayed in his mind for days. He replayed her tone mentally, her words, the kindness in her eyes. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it was something he hadn't felt in years. Mattering, visibility, being important to someone. In his journal dated April 22nd, 2023, he wrote, "When she looks at me, I feel real, like I exist beyond being Thomas's failure of a brother. If he loved her the way she deserves, maybe I wouldn't feel this way." The rectory that once seemed Thomas's domain slowly became the stage for Michael's growing fantasy. He started waking earlier to prepare coffee before Catherine entered the kitchen, timing it perfectly so she'd see him waiting. He asked about her programs, learned the names of volunteers and donors, discussed outreach strategy, topics that barely mattered to him before. She thought he was simply trying to connect and find common ground. He thought it meant they were connecting on a deeper level. At parish gatherings with extended Hayes family relatives, people noticed how easily Michael laughed at Catherine's comments and how she politely redirected when he leaned too close during conversations. During group photos, nobody said anything directly. Thomas was too preoccupied with an overwhelming caseload of parish responsibilities to notice subtle shifts in household dynamics. His calendar stretched impossibly thin. Even when physically at the rectory, his attention remained focused on canon law references and pastoral preparation. When Catherine mentioned feeling emotionally distant, he dismissed it with logic. "We both knew what this vocation would demand when we took our vows." Michael overheard that conversation once while passing through the hallway, and the seed planted months earlier grew and took deeper root. He told himself he wasn't jealous. He was simply noticing what Thomas couldn't see, that Catherine felt lonely, unappreciated, that she deserved more attention than theological debates and administrative meetings. By summer 2023, tension filled spaces nobody openly discussed. Michael lingered in rooms longer than appropriate. Catherine tried maintaining boundaries, but sometimes found herself drawn into conversations that felt uncomfortably personal. One evening, as Boston's afternoon rain hit the windows, Michael sat across from her at the kitchen table and said quietly, "You know, he doesn't really see you. He sees the role you play in his ministry." Catherine looked up, confused and uncomfortable. "That's not true, Michael," she said firmly. "Thomas is dedicated to his calling." Michael smiled slightly, voice soft but insistent. "I didn't say he wasn't dedicated. I said he doesn't see you." She ended the conversation immediately, excusing herself to her office, but the discomfort remained like humidity after rain. A week later, Thomas mentioned to a fellow priest during lunch near the archdiocese offices, "Things are tense at the rectory. I think Michael's struggling more than he admits. I don't know how to help without making things worse." His colleague, a senior priest with decades of experience, advised distance. "Kindness gets misinterpreted, Thomas, especially by those who feel they have nothing." Thomas agreed in principle, but maintaining that distance was already too late. Michael had already confused basic human decency with something it wasn't, transforming ordinary compassion into the foundation of an obsession that would soon demand to be seen. What nobody at St. Augustine's could predict was the damage one childhood phrase repeated endlessly could cause decades later. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" That question, repeated enough times, becomes a wound, and wounds that never heal eventually demand attention in the most destructive way possible. December 2023. Michael had begun executing his plan with meticulous care. The first step was creating evidence where none existed. He searched through public social media accounts, photos of women who lived far from Boston, in cities like Chicago or Atlanta, far enough to avoid accidental recognition. He saved their pictures, created fake profiles with generic names, built complete personas with favorite music, vacation photos, common slang pulled from comment sections. They didn't have to be perfect, just real enough to raise suspicion. On January 12, 2024, he sent the first message to Thomas's parish email, brief, deliberately suggestive. "Last night meant everything to me. I can't stop thinking about you." Thomas read the message, frowned in confusion, and responded immediately, "You have the wrong person. Please don't contact me again." He deleted it and mentioned it to Catherine that evening as a strange mistake. She dismissed it without concern, but deleting it didn't erase the seed Michael planned to plant. When that single message didn't provoke the reaction he imagined, he intensified his efforts. He created more profiles, using different photos and varying tones, as if multiple women were reaching out. Some messages were flirtatious, others emotionally desperate. One said, "I know you feel it too. Stop pretending we don't matter." Another appeared as a comment on the parish's public Facebook page with 3 rose emojis and the words, "Proud of you, as always." Catherine blocked accounts as soon as they appeared, but blocking them didn't protect her from perception. Now a pattern was forming, something Thomas began to notice. Michael watched from across the rectory as Thomas reviewed Catherine's phone one evening with furrowed brow and concerned expression. "Who are these people?" he asked quietly. "I have no idea," she responded honestly, frustration in her voice. "They're just random accounts. I keep blocking them. The messages didn't stay only digital. They began appearing in physical spaces where they were harder to ignore." In February 2024, Catherine had started using a private study room at the Boston Public Library to prepare sensitive parish documents. One afternoon, when she returned to the rectory, she found a small gift inside her work bag, something she didn't remember receiving. Inside was expensive perfume and a handwritten note in elegant script for the next time we meet. She showed it to Thomas with genuine confusion and visible concern. "I don't know where this came from," she said. Thomas wanted to believe her. He desperately wanted to dismiss it as a mistake, but doubt had begun doing its silent work. Michael observed the hesitation in his brother's eyes, the pause before Thomas nodded and said he believed her. That pause told Michael everything he needed to know. The foundation was cracking. As winter gave way to early spring, the manipulation sharpened with surgical precision. Michael began timing messages to appear when Thomas could see notification lights on Catherine's phone. He left his own device face down in common areas, certain nobody would think to check his activity. He commented on her social media posts when Thomas was nearby. Nothing dramatic, just suggestive enough that someone would look twice. The uncomfortable truth was how subtle everything remained. It wasn't chaos, it was erosion, a slow removal of trust, grain by grain. When trust weakens, imagination fills the void. Thomas didn't confront Catherine immediately. He did what people who fear being wrong usually do. He observed. He paid attention to how quickly she responded to certain messages. He studied her reactions when notifications arrived. He analyzed how she explained her day, searching for inconsistencies that didn't exist. And Michael, moving silently through the rectory like a ghost, noticed every flash of doubt that appeared in his brother's expression. One night in late February, Thomas asked cautiously, "Catherine, is there something you need to tell me?" She looked up from her files, genuinely confused. "About what?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. Forget it." The conversation ended there, not because either wanted it to, but because neither knew how to continue without seeming paranoid or guilty. But messages and gifts weren't enough. Suspicions could be denied. Accusations could be explained away. Michael needed something tangible, something physical that spoke louder than any denial. And on March 8, 2024, he found his moment. Thomas had a late evening mass scheduled, one of those mandatory services he couldn't miss. Michael offered to run errands and asked to borrow Thomas's car, claiming his motorcycle needed repairs. Thomas handed over the keys without hesitation, distracted by preparation for the service. Michael drove to a shopping centre in Cambridge, purchased items from the list Thomas had given him, and carefully saved the receipt. Then he parked in a corner of the lot where security cameras had limited angles. From his backpack, he pulled a carefully folded item he'd purchased days earlier at an adult novelty store in a neighbourhood far from the parish. A small toy, unmistakably intimate in nature, chosen specifically because it could never be confused as something belonging in a priest's vehicle. Michael lifted the driver's seat cushion just enough to slide the object underneath, positioning it so it would be visible if someone bent down to retrieve something from the floor. The action took less than 15 seconds, but those 15 seconds rewrote 3 lives forever. That night, Thomas returned to the rectory after midnight, exhausted from the service. He went to retrieve his phone charger from the car, keys still in hand. He opened the driver's door, bent down to look under the seat where he thought it had fallen, and saw it. Not a text message, not a social media comment, something he could touch, something that didn't belong in his car or his life. The silence in that parking lot was the kind nobody hears, but everyone feels. He stood frozen, breath-catching, mind racing through impossible explanations. From the rectory window above, Michael watched his brother's silhouette through the dim parking lot lighting. He didn't blink, didn't look away, just waited to see if Thomas would collapse in silence or call Catherine immediately. Either outcome served his purpose. The trap was set, and now all he had to do was wait for it to close. November 3rd, 2024, 9:52 p.m. The rectory was silent, the kind of silence that normally meant a long day had ended. But for Thomas, the silence felt different that night. Catherine stood in the common room holding the toy she'd found in Thomas's car earlier that day. Her hands trembled slightly, but her expression was controlled, accusatory. Thomas entered through the door, loosening his collar, and froze when he saw what she held. "What is that?" he asked, genuine confusion crossing his face. His voice was weak, strained. "You tell me, Thomas. I found it in your car." He stepped forward, bewildered. "I have no idea where that came from, Catherine, I swear to God." But she interrupted, losing composure. "Don't lie to me, not after everything." He raised his hands slowly, as if approaching something fragile about to shatter. "Listen to me. I've never been with anyone. I would never violate my vows." His voice broke with desperation. She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "You're doing exactly what sinners do, denying everything even when the evidence is right in front of you." He moved closer, taking her arm. "You're assuming my guilt without hearing me. Let's talk about this rationally." She raised her voice. "Rationally? You want me to be rational when I find this in your car?" The argument escalated quickly. Voices rose, a glass fell and shattered. Thomas tried calming her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Catherine, breathe, please. Just listen to me." But she couldn't hear anything. She reached back toward the kitchen counter, where a knife had been left earlier from meal preparation. She didn't choose it, it was simply there. The first strike came before either understood what was happening. Thomas gasped, hands going to his chest. The second strike followed immediately. By the time rational thought could intervene, it was too late. 58 wounds. The medical examiner would later document. 58 moments, driven not by hatred, but by devastation, by the collapse of everything she believed was true. Neighbors reported hearing a scream that didn't sound like anger, but like pain, like someone watching their entire world disintegrate. When police arrived at 11:47 p.m., they found Catherine sitting on the floor beside Thomas's body, clothes soaked, hands covered in dried blood. She wasn't crying, staring at nothing. Her voice was barely audible. "He destroyed everything, everything we believed in." As officers gently placed handcuffs on her wrists, she whispered, "Ask him, just ask him," as if Thomas could still answer, as if truth could still be recovered. The investigation began immediately, and detectives noticed something inconsistent. There was no evidence of misconduct anywhere, no phone records, no credit card statements, no travel history. Thomas's routine had never varied. When the cyber unit traced the anonymous messages, they all led to prepaid devices purchased with cash. But IP records revealed they all came from the same location, St. Augustine's Rectory. During hours when Michael was alone, security footage from stores showed him purchasing the prepaid phone. The toy matched a purchase made at an adult store near his usual locations. When confronted, Michael initially tried maintaining innocence, but faced with irrefutable digital evidence, he finally broke down. "I just wanted him to feel what I felt my whole life," he said quietly. Tears in his eyes, invisible, worthless, like nothing I did mattered. His voice cracked. "I didn't think she'd actually kill him. I just wanted to ruin what he had." When detectives showed Catherine the evidence, she read each line silently. The fake profiles, the planted messages, the fabricated affair that never existed, the toy she'd believed without question. She whispered hoarsely, "I murdered my brother in Christ over something that was never real." For the first time in her career serving the church, the woman who'd built her life pursuing truth faced a lie she'd believed completely. Thomas's parents attended every day of the trial, faces marked by permanent grief. Catherine was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, as the jury recognized emotional collapse rather than premeditation. 15 years. Michael received 8 years for obstruction of justice, fraud, and reckless conduct. During sentencing, the judge looked at him with disgust. "You destroyed a family from within using nothing but envy and deception." In her final statement, Catherine stood slowly and said, "The tragedy of this case is that truth came too late, and now all that remains is what cannot be undone." She looked toward the empty seat where Thomas once sat during parish meetings and sat back down. From prison, she rejected every letter Michael sent, returning all envelopes unopened. Thomas's parents created a foundation in his name, offering mental health resources to clergy and digital literacy training to prevent identity manipulation. The foundation's mission statement read, "No one should lose their life because doubts weren't questioned." In the end, 3 lives were destroyed. Thomas lost everything to a lie. Catherine lost the man she'd served God alongside because of her own certainty. And Michael finally got what he wanted, his brother's attention, but at a cost none of them could have imagined. In a courtroom where justice was served, but healing would never come.